Long ago, in a world filled with suffering, inequality, and spiritual confusion, a single man began a journey that would echo across centuries. This is not just the story of a religion. It is the story of a search for peace, for meaning, and for a way out of the endless cycle of pain that life so often brings. The story of Buddhism begins not with gods or empires, but with a question: why do we suffer? And is there a way to end it? This is the tale of a prince who left behind his palace, a man who walked away from comfort in power to understand the human condition. It is also the story of how his discovery grew into one of the most influential belief systems in history, touching billions of lives, inspiring great works of art and philosophy, and continuing to offer guidance to people today. But Buddhism is more than a man and more than a message. It is a path walked by monks and emperors, rebels and poets, seekers and skeptics. It spread through kingdoms and mountains, flourished in golden temples and quiet monasteries, survived invasions, and transformed itself again and again across continents. In this journey through time, we will explore where it all began, how the teachings took root and grew, and what they mean in the modern world. From ancient India to modern Los Angeles, from meditation halls to busy city streets, the voice of the Buddha continues to whisper across time. So let us begin, not with a God descending from the heavens, but with a question that every person asks at some point in their life. What is the cause of our suffering? And how can we be free? Before the Buddha ever took his first breath, the world he would be born into was already ancient and deeply spiritual. In the vast plains and forests of the Indian subcontinent, life pulsed with tradition, ritual, and a profound sense of order. The people of this land lived under the powerful influence of the Vedic religion, a complex system built around sacred texts, fire sacrifices, and a rigid social structure. The priests, or Brahmins, held great power. They were the keepers of sacred chants and the only ones who could communicate with the divine. Religion was not personal. It was ceremonial, bound to duty and caste. Society was divided into a strict hierarchy. At the top were the priests, followed by warriors, merchants, and finally, the servants. Below them, all were those considered untouchable, people believed to be outside the system entirely. A person's birth determined their destiny. One could not rise above their caste, and suffering was often explained away as the result of past karma, a punishment earned in some forgotten life. But not everyone accepted this world as it was. Across the forests and villages of India, wandering seekers known as Shramanas began to question the system. They left their homes and renounced worldly ties in search of deeper truths. They meditated, fasted, debated, and experimented with extreme practices. Some starved themselves to silence the body. Others sat in stillness for days, trying to master the mind. These were spiritual revolutionaries, looking not to honor tradition, but to find liberation from it. It was into this world of both rigid order and rising unrest that Siddhartha Gautama was born. He would inherit wealth and status, but his destiny lay not in ruling a kingdom, but in challenging the very foundations of how his world understood life, death, and the meaning of it all. In the quiet gardens of Lumbini, under the swaying branches of ancient trees, a queen gave birth to a child who would one day change the spiritual course of humanity. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, and his birth was surrounded by signs and wonders. Legend tells us that Queen Maya dreamed of a white elephant entering her womb, a symbol of purity and greatness. On the day of his birth, flowers bloomed out of season, birds sang in harmony, and the earth trembled ever so slightly, as if it too sensed what had just arrived. Siddhartha was born into privilege, the son of King Hudodana of the Kshatriya clan. His family ruled over a small but prosperous kingdom nestled in the foothills of the Himalayas, in what is now modern-day Nepal. From the moment he was born, sages and astrologers predicted his future would be unlike any other. They saw two possible paths. One, he would become a great king, a ruler who would conquer the world. Or, if he ever saw suffering, he would turn away from earthly power and become a great spiritual teacher. His father, fearing the second outcome, chose to shelter the boy from the world. Siddhartha grew up surrounded by beauty and comfort. He lived in 3 magnificent palaces, one for each season, filled with music, fine foods, and every luxury imaginable. Pain, sickness, and death were kept far from his sight. The king believed that if his son never saw the suffering of the world, he would never be moved to renounce it. But destiny is not so easily controlled. Beneath the silk and gold, Siddhartha carried a question deep in his heart, a question that even a palace could not silence. What is the true nature of life? And why, if we are born into such splendor, do we still feel empty? As Siddhartha grew older, the comforts of palace life began to feel like a golden cage. He was married young, had a son, and lived a life most would envy. But within him stirred a quiet restlessness, a feeling that something essential was being hidden from him. Then one day, with curiosity gnawing at his soul, he convinced his charioteer to take him beyond the palace walls. That single decision would unravel everything he thought he knew. Outside, Siddhartha encountered 4 sights that shattered his illusion of a perfect world. First, he saw an old man hunched and frail, a body worn down by time. Then he saw a sick man, his body trembling with pain. Next, he saw a corpse being carried to a funeral pyre, the final silence of death. And finally, he saw a wandering ascetic, dressed in rags, yet strangely peaceful. For the first time, Siddhartha saw the truth that all life is marked by suffering, and that even the strongest are not spared by age, illness, or death. The fourth sight, the calm ascetic, offered a glimpse of a possible path, a way to confront and perhaps even transcend the suffering of life. That night, Siddhartha made a quiet, heartbreaking decision. He kissed his sleeping wife and child goodbye, left behind his crown, his riches, and his name. He exchanged royal robes for a simple cloth and stepped into the wilderness as a seeker. He studied under wise teachers, mastering deep meditations and philosophical systems. He practiced severe austerities, starving himself until his body was barely more than bone. Yet no matter how hard he tried, enlightenment eluded him. He realized that both indulgence and extreme self-denial were distractions. So he sat beneath a Bodhi tree in silent resolve, vowing not to rise until he had uncovered the truth. Days passed, temptations came, doubts whispered, but he did not move. And then, as the morning star rose, Siddhartha opened his eyes, not as a prince or a seeker, but as the Buddha, the awakened one. He had seen through illusion, pierced the nature of reality, and discovered a path that could free all beings from suffering. After his awakening under the Bodhi tree, the Buddha sat in stillness, not in pride, but in deep compassion. He had found the answer to the suffering of the world, but the question remained. Would anyone understand what he had seen? Would anyone be ready to walk the path he had discovered? For a moment he hesitated. The truth he had uncovered was subtle and profound, not easily put into words. But then he thought of all living beings caught in the cycle of pain and rebirth, and he rose. Not for glory, but to teach. The Buddha's first sermon was given in a deer park in Sarnath, to 5 former companions who had once shared his life of harsh asceticism. There, with simplicity and clarity, he laid out the foundation of what would become one of the world's great spiritual traditions. He began with a diagnosis of the human condition, the 4 noble truths. First, life is suffering, not in a pessimistic sense, but as a recognition that life, even in its joys, carries within it pain. We age, we lose what we love, we desire what we cannot have. This is dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness at the heart of existence. Second, suffering has a cause. It arises from craving, from attachment to things that are impermanent. We cling to pleasure, power, identity, all the while chasing illusions that cannot last. Third, there is a way to end suffering. Liberation is possible. The flame of craving can be extinguished, and with it, the endless cycle of rebirth. Fourth, the path to that liberation is the Noble Eightfold Path. It is a middle way between indulgence and denial, a guide to right living. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Not rules to obey, but a way to see, to act, to awaken. With these teachings, the Buddha began a revolution of the soul. A new kind of path, one that did not depend on caste or status, but only on understanding and effort. The Dharma was born, and the journey of Buddhism had truly begun. The Buddha spent the next 45 years walking the dusty roads of northern India, teaching all who would listen. From kings and merchants to farmers and beggars, he spoke with calm conviction, not preaching dogma, but offering a path to freedom. His presence was not that of a prophet with divine thunder, but of a man who had seen deeply into the nature of life and returned with compassion in his eyes. People gathered in forests, villages, and courtyards to hear him speak. And slowly, the small flame of his awakening began to ignite others. The Buddha welcomed all, women and men, rich and poor, high caste and untouchables. In a society rigidly divided, this was a radical gesture. Monastic communities began to form, called the Sangha, made up of those who renounced the household life to follow the path fully. They shaved their heads, wore simple robes, and lived by alms, carrying only a bowl, depending on the kindness of others. In return, they gave something far more valuable: wisdom, discipline, and peace. But the Buddha's teachings were not limited to monks and nuns. Lay people, too, could follow the path in their daily lives through ethical living, generosity, and mindfulness. The teachings spread by word of mouth, passed from teacher to student, memorized with precision. Temples were rare in the beginning. The teachings lived in people's hearts and voices. After the Buddha's death, the Sangha held councils to preserve his teachings. They gathered and recited everything he had said, committing it to memory and eventually writing it down in the Pali Canon. Disagreements arose, different interpretations formed, and slowly, various schools of Buddhism emerged. In time, the teachings found favor with kings and emperors. The most famous was Emperor Ashoka of the Maurya dynasty. After witnessing the horrors of war, Ashoka embraced Buddhism and helped spread it across the Indian subcontinent. He built monasteries, supported monks, and sent emissaries as far as Sri Lanka and Central Asia. Under his patronage, Buddhism moved from a quiet forest tradition to a force that could shape civilization. India, the birthplace of Buddhism, became a land filled with stupas, monastic universities, and travelers seeking truth. Yet even as it spread outward, the heart of the Buddha's teaching remained unchanged. Liberation was possible, not through sacrifice or bloodline, but through clarity, compassion, and effort. As centuries passed, the teachings of the Buddha continued to spread and evolve. From the simple gatherings in forests to vast monastic complexes and sophisticated philosophical systems, Buddhism was no longer one tradition, but many voices echoing a single truth. Among these voices, two major schools began to rise, Theravāda and Mahāyāna each, with its own emphasis and vision, yet rooted in the same quest to understand suffering and find liberation. Theravāda, often referred to as the teaching of the elders, sought to preserve the Buddha's original words and practices with great discipline. It emphasized the monastic life, meditation, and personal enlightenment. In this tradition, the ideal was the arhat, one who has attained nirvana through rigorous self-effort and insight. Theravāda Buddhism remained closest to the ancient texts and became deeply rooted in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Monks in saffron robes walked through villages at dawn, collecting alms, teaching Dharma, and serving as living reminders of the Buddhist path. Mahāyāna, meaning the great vehicle, emerged with a broader, more inclusive vision. It honored the same truths, but expanded the scope. In Mahāyāna, the goal was not just personal liberation, but the awakening of all beings. The central figure became the Bodhisattva, a compassionate being who, even on the brink of nirvana, turns back to help others reach it too. The heart of this path was karuna compassion that moved with action. Mahāyāna texts introduced vast new cosmologies, poetic sutras, and deep philosophical insights. The Lotus Sutra and the Heart Sutra, for example, offered visions of a universe alive with awakened potential. This school flourished in China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, adapting to each culture it touched. In China, it merged with Taoist ideas and became Chan, which would later become Zen in Japan. In these lands, Buddhism grew temples like mountains, carved statues into cliffs, painted mandalas, and sang sutras that echoed through centuries. It was still the same message: freedom through wisdom and compassion, but told in different tongues and symbols. Though differences arose, these two great traditions continued side by side, each offering something vital. Theravāda offered discipline and simplicity, the quiet walk inward. Mahāyāna offered vision and grace, the vow to return for others. Both pointed to the same truth, that beyond all names and forms, the awakened mind is free, luminous, and kind. As empires rose and fell, and traders crossed deserts and mountains with caravans of silk, spices, and gold, something else journeyed with them. It was not a material possession, but a path, a vision, a teaching that transcended borders. Buddhism, born under the shade of Indian fig trees, now began to travel the Great Silk Road, carried not by conquerors, but by pilgrims, monks, and humble merchants. What started as a local tradition was becoming a world religion. The Silk Road was more than a trade route. It was a lifeline of culture, connecting the great civilizations of India, China, Persia, and Rome. Along this path, ideas flowed as freely as goods. Buddhist monks, drawn by a sense of mission and the thirst for knowledge, set out into the unknown. They braved arid plains, high passes, and foreign tongues, determined to bring the Dharma to new lands. They carried scriptures written on palm leaves, statues of the Buddha, and stories that would light the imagination of distant peoples. One of the earliest centers to receive Buddhism outside of India was Gandhara, in present-day Pakistan and Afghanistan. Here, the teachings mixed with Greek artistic influences left by Alexander the Great, producing the first images of the Buddha in human form. These statues with serene faces and flowing robes would become iconic across Asia. From there, Buddhism moved into Central Asia, finding refuge in oasis towns like Samarkand and Khotan. Monasteries sprang up along trade routes, offering not just religious guidance, but shelter, food, and knowledge. These were places of safety in harsh landscapes, where weary travelers could rest and reflect. The monks preserved texts, translated them into local languages, and taught meditation to those curious enough to listen. Eventually, Buddhism entered China. At first, it was met with confusion. Its Indian roots were foreign to Chinese philosophy. But through centuries of adaptation, translation, and conversation with Confucian and Taoist thinkers, Buddhism began to take root. Monasteries flourished. Emperors offered support. Great pilgrim monks like Faxian and Xuanzang journeyed back to India to gather scriptures and deepen their understanding. The Dharma was not static. It adapted, absorbed, and bloomed in new soil. Through the Silk Road, Buddhism became a bridge between East and West, between India's spiritual insight and the cultures of China, Korea, and eventually Japan. It spread not with force, but with patience, kindness, and the quiet conviction of those who had tasted the truth of suffering and the promise of liberation. By the time Buddhism reached the far corners of East Asia, it had already traveled for centuries, shaped by the lands and languages it touched. Yet in China, Korea, and Japan, the teachings would take on entirely new life. Here, Buddhism did not just survive, it flourished, transforming into something uniquely suited to the rhythm and spirit of these cultures. Among the many schools that developed, one stood out for its directness and simplicity: Zen. When Buddhism entered China, it encountered a deeply rooted tradition of Confucian ethics and Taoist thought. The new teachings were rich but foreign, filled with strange terms and elaborate metaphysics. But as Chinese monks began to translate the sutras and live the path, they adapted the Dharma into something that resonated with their own worldview. They emphasized the essence over the form, the experience over the scripture. Out of this blending arose Chan Buddhism, known later in Japan as Zen. It was less concerned with scholarly study and more focused on meditation, silence, and the direct transmission of insight. Zen did not rely on long debates or sacred texts. It asked a single question: can you see your true nature right now? Teachers gave their students riddles called koans, designed to shatter the thinking mind. A monk might be asked, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" Or, "What was your original face before you were born?" The point was not to find an answer, but to break through illusion. Zen temples became places of discipline and simplicity. Monks rose before dawn, sat in long hours of meditation, worked in silence, and found awakening in the ordinary. Sweeping the floor or making tea was no less sacred than reciting scripture. Everything was practice. Everything was a mirror of the mind. As Zen moved from China to Korea and then to Japan, it continued to evolve. In Japan, it deeply influenced art, architecture, poetry, and even martial arts. The stark beauty of a Zen garden, the silence of a tea ceremony, the brushstroke of a calligrapher were shaped by the Zen spirit. It was a Buddhism stripped to its core, moment-by-moment awareness, free from attachment. But Zen was only one branch. In East Asia, Mahāyāna Buddhism also took the form of Pure Land devotion, focused on faith in the Amitabha Buddha and the promise of rebirth in a realm of bliss. Monks like Honen and Shinran made the teachings accessible to everyone, even farmers and laborers. It was no longer a path only for scholars and monks. All were welcome. In this way, Buddhism became part of the cultural and spiritual life of East Asia. It offered silence and ritual, logic and mystery, depth and grace. And always, beneath it all, was the same voice that began with a man sitting beneath a tree, gazing into the nature of his own mind. As the world entered the modern age, borders blurred, empires fell, and ideas began to move with a new speed. Ships crossed oceans. Books were printed and spread like wildfire. Scholars, explorers, and seekers found themselves drawn to distant lands and ancient wisdom. Among the teachings that sparked fascination in the Western world, Buddhism stood out. With its calm presence and profound insight into the human condition, it offered something both exotic and strangely familiar. The meeting of Buddhism and the West was not just a cultural exchange. It was a quiet revolution of thought. In the 19th century, European travelers and colonizers in Asia began to take interest in Buddhist philosophy. They encountered serene temples in Sri Lanka, massive statues in Burma, sacred texts in Tibet. Scholars translated sutras and analyzed them through the lens of classical philosophy. They compared the Buddha with Socrates, Kant, and even Jesus, amazed by his rational approach to suffering and ethics. Buddhism was seen not as a religion in the traditional Western sense, but as a psychology, a philosophy, even a science of the mind. Writers and thinkers such as Schopenhauer and later Carl Jung found inspiration in its principles. By the early 20th century, theosophists and spiritualists in Europe and America began incorporating Buddhist ideas into their teachings. In parallel, Asian teachers began to make the journey west. Figures like Anagarika Dharmapala and D.T. Suzuki brought the Dharma to English-speaking audiences, sparking interest in Theravāda meditation and Zen practice. After World War II, this trickle became a stream. Soldiers returning from Asia brought back Buddhist art and ideas. Beat poets like Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg embraced Zen. By the 1960s, a generation of spiritual seekers disillusioned with materialism and war turned to the East for answers. Meditation centers and monasteries began to appear in Europe and North America. Teachers from Thailand, Tibet, Vietnam, and Japan settled in the West, opening doors to ancient practices that were new to many. Buddhism's approach appealed to modern minds. Its emphasis on mindfulness, impermanence, and self-awareness spoke to people living in fast, anxious societies. Its lack of dogma and its invitation to explore experience firsthand gave it a unique place in a world often divided by faith. Psychologists began studying the effects of meditation. Neuroscientists found that Buddhist practices could reshape the brain. Mindfulness entered schools, hospitals, and therapy rooms. Yet the encounter was not one-sided. Buddhism itself began to adapt again, as it had always done. In the West, it became more egalitarian, often led by lay people and women. Teachings were given in living rooms, online, and in retreat centers far from temples. New forms emerged, still rooted in the Four Noble Truths, still pointing to the same freedom. This was not the Buddhism of robes and incense alone. It was a living, breathing path that met people where they were. And in the meeting of East and West, something ancient was remembered, that peace does not belong to any one land or culture. It lives wherever people take the time to see clearly, breathe deeply, and awaken the heart. Today, Buddhism exists in a world more connected than ever before. Planes fly across continents in hours, phones carry voices and teachings across oceans, and people from vastly different backgrounds can sit together in silence, breathing in unison, practicing the ancient path laid down over 2,000 years ago. From remote Himalayan monasteries to busy urban meditation centers, from monks chanting in temples to lay people scrolling through guided sessions online, Buddhism continues to evolve. And yet, at its heart, it remains remarkably unchanged. The Four Noble Truths still speak to the human condition. Life contains suffering. Craving leads to suffering. There is a way out, and that way is the Noble Eightfold Path. These truths are just as relevant now as they were under the Bodhi tree in ancient India. Whether someone is overwhelmed by the stress of modern life, grieving a loss, or simply searching for peace in a world filled with noise, the teachings of the Buddha offer a way to wake up. Buddhism today is not one thing, but many. It flourishes in Theravāda traditions across Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Myanmar, where monks preserve early teachings with deep devotion. It thrives in Mahāyāna schools across China, Korea, and Japan, where temples still echo with chants that have been sung for centuries. In the Tibetan plateau, Vajrayana Buddhism keeps alive complex rituals and deep tantric practices, even in exile. And in the West, a new, often secular approach to Buddhism has emerged, emphasizing mindfulness, compassion, and insight without requiring religious identity. Despite these differences, there is a shared thread, the commitment to awakening, to seeing things as they truly are, to reducing harm and cultivating kindness. The challenges of modern life are different from those of the ancient world, but the inner struggles remain the same. Fear, anger, desire, confusion, these are timeless, and so too is the medicine. As new generations discover meditation apps and attend retreats, as scientists continue to explore the benefits of mindfulness, and as global crises force deeper reflection, Buddhism offers not escape, but clarity. It invites us to face reality gently and bravely. It reminds us that freedom is not found in another place, another life, or another belief, but right here, in this breath, this step, this moment. Buddhism does not demand faith. It encourages investigation. It does not preach from authority. It points with quiet confidence to the possibility of ending suffering. It does not belong to Asia or the West, or to monks or scholars. It belongs to humanity. The path is always waiting. Not in the future, not in the past, but now. In sitting quietly, in listening deeply, in acting with compassion. The journey is long, but it begins, as it always has, with a single moment of awareness. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey through the story of Buddhism, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories of history, myth, and meaning.